So we've got a very interesting panel here. I'm just going to introduce the speakers. We've got about 20 minutes for each of them. I have a 5-minute card, a 2-minute card, a 1-minute card, and if they go over, I'm going to break into song. None of us want that to happen, so I'm encouraging everyone to keep to the time. So, Forging Knowledge and Culture, we have a paper, Soft Power in the Digital Age, Culture and Circulation by Brian Edwards, Associate Professor of the Department of English at Northwestern University. The Lost Letters, Gandhi and Women's History by Geraldine Forbes, Distinguished Professor Emeritus, the Department of History at the State University of New York. We've got Pashtun Ethnic Loyalty as a Political Resource in Pakistan and Afghanistan by our own Anatol Lieven, who's a full professor here. We've got Lived Realities and Discourses on the Lives of Women by our own Amira Sonbol, who is Professor of History and Chair of our faculty. And finally, Forbidden Fruits, The Political Economy of Science, Religion, and Growth by Davide Ticchi, Professor, IMT Institute for Advanced Studies, Lucha.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organizers, Mohammad Reza Pirhai and especially Firat Uruch, for inviting me to come out here. It's a pleasure to be a part of the conference, and the staff and all of the organizers and the staff, and especially Jill, and Maha, and Jill, who's at the hotel right now, I think, so I can't thank her in person for all the help that they've provided on the logistical level. Is fantastic. One of the best organized conferences I've ever been to. So the title of the paper is Soft Power in the Digital Age, Culture and Circulation. And in this paper, I will be bringing together disciplines of comparative literature and cultural anthropology, as well as interdisciplinary fields of American studies and Middle East studies. And I do so in order to address questions relevant to cultural diplomacy. I've been struck and impressed by the interdisciplinarity of this program, which was apparent from the start. And I wanted to say that I think interdisciplinarity, however, should not be merely a hodgepodge of approaches. I'm saying that to my own work, but rather should build on the ways that the various disciplines ask research questions and the kinds of evidence that they consider valid for making their cases. This conference is not per se about asking methodological questions about interdisciplinarity, but I wanted to bring this to the fore because it may highlight the kind of intervention I want to make here with respect to cultural diplomacy, a field that is generally considered by political scientists, from whom I have learned much, to be sure, and whom I hope to engage. In the fuller introduction, I'm a professor of comparative literature as well as Middle East studies, so I'm bringing that out to the fore. We might, however, enrich our discussion of cultural diplomacy by incorporating some of the discussions or approaches within cultural studies, generally speaking, including both comparative literary studies and sociocultural anthropology, so as to remind ourselves how rich, how unpredictable that term cultural within cultural diplomacy is. I think a part of the term that doesn't get as much attention. Here's the question that I'm asking. What happens when cultural products move from one context into another, beyond the publics they have evoked or imagined, and when there is an active uptake in a radically different social or cultural setting? And as a follow-up, what would a rich sense of global circulation mean to the working premises of cultural diplomacy? Now, in the Cold War, U.S. diplomats considered that American cultural products could play a role in geopolitics, as well known, as Hisham Aidi discussed a little bit yesterday in his paper and in his work in general. As William Rugg has argued in his new book, Frontline Public Diplomacy, in the post-war 1940s, members of the Truman administration saw the value of engaging in what would later come to be called public diplomacy to counter Soviet propaganda. Rugg traces this impulse back to Franklin Roosevelt's Office of War Information during World War II, the creation of Voice of America, and the establishment of a network of information centers. Then further back to World War I and Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information. He ultimately finds traces of the concept in the founding document itself, the Declaration of Independence, and he quotes it in a way that I hadn't heard before. Quote, "Let facts be submitted to a candid world," Rugg quotes from the Declaration, and sees that as a kind of an impulse towards public diplomacy from the very beginning. But if the Declaration imagined that powerful words would themselves spread a message internationally. In the Cold War, the means and methods had become more sophisticated. Then, during the Eisenhower administration, agencies such as the U.S. Information Agency and the Fulbright Exchange Program, among others, were established, as well as the sponsorship of cultural tours, the jazz tours, et cetera, that we talked a little bit about yesterday. Now, the logics by which they considered the export of American cultural products, from abstract expressionism to jazz tours to readings by American authors abroad, fulfilled many of the prescriptions made by Henry Luce just prior to the entry of the United States into World War II. In February 1941, what Luce had called the American Century in his famous Life magazine editorial was, after all, not so much a temporal demarcation, a period of time, though of course it's often misunderstood in that way, but rather a logic of how culture moves through the world. Quote, "America is responsible to herself as well as to history," Luce wrote, "for the world environment in which she lives." And in his examples, Luce, a magazine editor who understood circulation in its rich sense, American culture was itself already international. His examples were music, slang, among others, language, and therefore could spread its message seamlessly across the world. It's what I call a logic of broadcasting. Send out the culture, it will resonate, its meanings will be clear. Now, that assumption that one could broadcast American culture with a clear message, returned with energy in the 21st century, particularly in the wake of September 11th, 2001. However, in 1999, the actual apparatus around which so much cultural diplomacy of the United States had operated had been altered. Backroom deals between Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State for President Clinton, and Senator Jesse Helms, then chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, that had little to do with cultural diplomacy itself. Back payment of UN dues and a chemical test bans treaty was at stake, and the Cold War was apparently over in 1999, this dismantled the U.S. Information Agency, the USIA apparatus, and collapsed that which was left into the State Department. This is much lamented by people like Ambassador Rugg and those who had worked within USIA in structural terms. And Rugg's recent book from this past year, 2014, or just a couple months ago, discusses at length the role that public affairs officers, PAOs, had played, the seismic shift away from staffing in that area with numbers of members of staff and locally employed members as well in the various embassies, and the kind of person with job qualifications almost who did and should be in such jobs. But we can also note that what I will call major shifts that have less to do with the purported end of the Cold War and more to do with the changing epistemologies within which we all operate in a rapidly unfolding digital age have had an effect as well. In fact, geopolitical history, the end of the Cold War, will turn out to be deeply enfolded in technological and media history, the digital age. From 1999, that might not yet have been as clear to observers as it is now to us looking backward. But it affects all the premises on which cultural diplomacy operates. Let's put it this way. The context for the circulation of culture has altered dramatically, I would argue fundamentally, in the digital age. American cultural products are taken up with greater ease and speed across the world. How many of you have in your pockets right now a smartphone from which you could Skype, text message, or communicate with someone across the world at this moment? That, I argue, alters fundamentally the way in which the engagement with the cultural object, whether it be a novel, a film, or other forms of cultural production, works, and therefore under changes or pulls the rug out from the way in which we think of how culture moves through the world and what it means. Approaches that animate comparative literature and cultural anthropology allow us to approach anew debates relevant to cultural diplomacy. Together, circulation offers a new means and modes of comparison by drawing attention to the transnational movement of literary and cultural products as carrying meaning, without rejecting close reading. In comparative literature, there is an ongoing debate about what the alleged globalization of culture means to older patterns of reading literature in terms of national traditions. The terms of that debate now move between what some are calling world literature, various transnational affiliations between writers, and what those in another camp refer to as a more local set of concerns, a concern with the planet versus the world, with that which eludes translation or cannot be translated. In sociocultural anthropology, a new cohort of scholars has been interested in what those associated with the journal Public Culture have called cultures of circulation, an attention to the multiple and accelerating pathways by which peoples, cultural products, ideas, and media moved transnationally, and what sorts of methods and approaches scholars in the humanistic social sciences might take to make sense of some of these new forms and their impact. Here's a rich way of asking the question from within anthropology. It's not a new one, but it comes from within that discussion. Greg Urban, an anthropologist, in his book, Metaculture, How Culture Moves Through the Worlds, begins this way, the opening lines of his book, which I have stuck with me. Quote, "The answer is culture, but the riddle continues to vex, as if we have not gotten it, not seen quite clearly. What moves through space and time, yet has no Newtonian mass? What is communicated from individual, group to group, what is communicated from individual to individual, group to group, yet is not a disease," end quote. Of course, the answer is culture. Now, in my forthcoming book, After the American Century, Ends of Circulation in Casablanca, Cairo, and Tehran, which is due out in October from Columbia University Press, I developed circulation as mode and method by examining the circulation of literary and cinematic texts, as well as cultural products and forms originating in the United States, for example, comics, graphic novels, social networking software, Hollywood formulas, as they move into particular contexts in North Africa and the Middle East. I argue that because of the ways in which culture circulates in the digital age and the changed geopolitical status of the United States in the 21st century, we have entered a period after the American century. Meaning, again, remember that it's not a period of time, but a logic, meaning that American culture, long popular globally and assumed to have a positive message or benefit to U.S. politics, is generally taken up by individuals in ways that detach the cultural product from its American referent and thereby shatters the presumption of their close relationship upon which cultural diplomacy operates, that logic. Focusing on a series of cases from three contexts in North Africa and the Middle East, Casablanca, Cairo, and Tehran, I try to make sense of the fragmented meanings that American cultural objects and forms, with recognizably American sources, but unfamiliar in their use or application, now take in new and frequently unpredicted locations. In so doing, I'm trying to map out what the period after the American century looks like from the perspective of literature, film, and cultural production, and then ask what implications there are on ideas of cultural diplomacy. As you can imagine in this book, there's a number of cases and examples, and the part of me that's anthropologist and literary critic wants to delve deeply into each of those. So I'll end by telling one anecdote, in the last part of this paper, I'll talk about one anecdote. I've been researching this project for nearly a decade in multiple sites, and on one of my last research trips for the book, something happened in Rabat that revealed more about my argument than I expected it to so late in the process. So in my remaining time, I'll tell the story. I had just given a talk to a group of students and faculty at Mohammed VI University, the eminent state university in the Moroccan capital. My subject this day in November 2012 was what I called the American Autumn and its relationship to the Arab Spring. American Autumn was my shorthand for the paradoxical situation we find ourselves in, U.S. hegemony in decline economically and arguably politically, even while the products of American culture are ubiquitous. This paradox is especially apparent in Morocco, where I have lived, traveled, and researched over the past 2 decades. More and more, Moroccan culture incorporates elements of American culture, whether in the hip-hop of popular artists such as Hoba Hoba Spirit or Fener. Hisham Al-Aidi was talking about hip-hop yesterday and in his recent book. The dazzling commercial spaces of Casablanca's Morocco Mall, and that's what it's called in Moroccan Arabic, Morocco Mall, and Rabat's Mega Mall, or the sophisticated look of movies by younger directors such as Fawzi Ben Saidi and Leila Marakshi. Indeed, I was on my way on this particular trip to the Marrakesh International Film Festival, where many of the year's crop of Moroccan films seemed painted directly from an American palette. As one Moroccan director said to me about another, quote, "He's watched a lot of CSI, the American television show, Crime Scene Investigation, and it shows in his films." And it did. Yet if much of local culture looks increasingly American, I have witnessed a steady decline in attitudes towards the U.S. over the past dozen years. In my talk in Rabat, what I'm cutting is quite a long discussion of the ways in which the kind of filtering of American popular culture has moved through Morocco in the last 2 or 3 decades. In my talk in Rabat, I spent some time discussing a digital pirate artist named Hamada, who had been active in Morocco during the middle years of the first decade of the 2000s. There were about 25 people in attendance, and if you're interested in him, there's a whole chapter, part of a chapter in my book about him. He's a fascinating artist. And there were about 25 people in attendance, most of them students, plus a few faculty members from the department. The conversation after my talk was good, if a bit academic. Then someone made a comment, an intervention, we would call it in literary studies, that raised the stakes dramatically. A speaker started talking about the internet movie Innocence of Muslims. Students shifted in their chairs uneasily. He asked me, the questioner, half rhetorically, whether this was an example of culture exported by the United States to the Arab world. Some of the students became visibly upset. This clearly mattered to them. The film should be stopped, one said. It should be taken down off the internet. Now, my first impulse was to defend the principle of freedom of speech, even the most offensive speech. I also began to explain that the exception that many in the room were pointing to, France's so-called Gay-So law of 1990, which forbids Holocaust denial and also discrimination based on membership in an ethnic group, one of several such laws limiting free speech in Europe, was not in force in the United States, it being a European law, which had a different and more capacious sense of protected speech. But I also knew that paeans to the First Amendment didn't matter to the majority of these students. They were unimpressed. Here was a vivid case where the unpredictable pathways that cultural forms travel in the digital age mattered urgently. Sitting here, the cherished First Amendment of the US Constitution seemed to be part and parcel of American empire. What can Innocence of Muslims tell us about the circulation of American culture in the Middle East and North Africa? The short film was posted on YouTube on July 1st, 2012, when it attracted little attention. It had been screened at the Vine Theater in Hollywood one time, in late June, under the title Innocence of Bin Laden, to an audience of 10 people. It's been tracked down. But when a version dubbed into Arabic was introduced on YouTube in September, a couple of months after its original release on YouTube, it drew the notice of Egyptian media. On September 9th, Egyptian station El Nas broadcast a 2-minute clip by host Sheikh Khalid Abdullah. Other Egyptian bloggers and internet media outlets picked up the story, and in a single day, it quickly moved from Egypt across the Arab world and from there to the rest of the planet in a single day. With the anniversary of September 11th, 2001 approaching and fueled by attention from notorious figures such as Terry Jones, a small-time Florida pastor who had already achieved global infamy for threatening to burn the Quran on a previous anniversary of 9/11, large protests and demonstrations against the video took place against Muslim-majority countries. And I know many people remember this, but I'm telling this story to talk about circulation, about how this object will move, right? In Cairo, as protesters approached the U.S. Embassy, nervous diplomatic staff sent a message by Twitter that implicitly criticized the YouTube video or apologized for it, setting off a firestorm of critical media in the U.S. The following day, an attack on an American consulate in Benghazi, Libya, resulted in the killing of the U.S. ambassador and another American diplomat. And at the time, given the massive media coverage of protests over the video at a range of U.S. embassies and consulates in Muslim-majority countries, the assumption was, how could the assumption not be? You know the way media logic works, that the political assassination was linked to the reaction to the film. Later investigation put this initial assumption into question. The attack on the Benghazi consulate was apparently previously planned. I have it. But the debate affected the 2012 presidential campaign and impacted the political future of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And you know we'll hear more about this these days. All from a low-budget YouTube video. Now, two months later, 2,000 miles to the west of Benghazi and 2,700 miles west of Cairo, these comments electrified the room in Rabat. This was still a fresh wound across the Arab world. In my book, I discuss topics such as the impact of Hollywood formulas and narrative techniques on Moroccan cinema, how Iranians dub and redub CGI films like Shrek, which I've written about before, and the ways Egyptian novelists take American fiction, cyberpunk fiction in particular, in directions that would be unimaginable to the US authors who are being borrowed from. In cases such as these, there is a fracturing of the American original such that something from it jumps publics into a new sociocultural milieu. Looking backward, we can see the US origin of the cultural form, but what matters more is the creative novelty it has permitted to Arab and Iranian creators in the new context. Part of the pleasure in their play is, as we'll see, the collision of a global culture with a local subject. Iranian dubbings of Shrek are highly local, as are the details in the Egyptian graphic novels that I'm interested in. In the end, as these newer cultural forms and products make their way across the circulatory matrix, they may carry some of their Americanness with them, but they shed too the US as their point of origin or their ultimate meaning. This is one of the premises of a world beyond the American century. And yet, Innocence of Muslims was a case in which the American origin of the cultural product seemed deeply to matter, in which there was little rupture between the cultural product as American and the presumed link to US politics. Here, the content was anti-Islam, the form was pornography, if you have seen the film, or rather the look of softcore pornography without the sex scenes or the nudity. And the filmmaker was a pornographer as it came out, or had been. And the origin, the US, seemed all aligned here, form, content, and origin. As a result, the film had a vivid and powerful meaning in Moroccan, Egyptian, or Iranian society, which in turn affected politics. Was it an American century again, but here now only with negative effects? What did it mean that this film, offensive to so many, was made in the US by American actors and was distributed via YouTube? YouTube, an American website that otherwise was alleged to stand for freedom, innovation, and the democratizing potential of the internet, and which in many other contexts had allowed Arabs and Iranians to post videos that had worked against state censorship or autocratic rule. And the impact, for example, in Morocco of YouTube can be traced in actually opening up certain conversations and opening up a critique of corruption in the police that had not been possible before, for example. So did the form matter? What did the widespread circulation of this film made in the US, and as one person in the room pointed out, mean to American cultural diplomacy? What was the difference between unofficial cultural products such as Innocence of Muslims, from which the Obama administration was trying to keep its distance even while defending its right to exist, and other American cultural products emerging from more respectable or established venues, like Ben Affleck's blockbuster Argo, which provoked much controversy in Iran, and which is the subject of another chapter in my book. These are all questions that matter to public diplomacy and the ways in which the United States engages with the Arab world, Iran, and Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East, Central, South, and Southeast Asia. But they also matter to the ways in which we understand the ways literature, film, and other products of culture function in the digital age. I left the room at Mohammed Khamis University unsettled, both recommitted to the importance of describing and analyzing the way that cultural products move through the world, and aware that the changes in technology and democratization of access to massive distribution leads always to unpredictable ends, as the case of Innocence of Muslims demonstrated, with the pain and violence that followed in its wake. Thank you very much. You can
Thank you very much, Brian.
Good morning, and I would like to add my thanks to Brian's for being invited to what I found a very exciting conference. So I'm not talking about work that I've been doing for a very long time. This is very new work for me, so I will appreciate comments. In 1976, a man called Deepak Dutt Chaudhry, who was the son of the prominent Indian nationalist and feminist that is on your left, Sarla Devi Ghoshal Chodhrani, her son gave me the typed copies of Gandhi's letters written to his mother in 1920. So the photo is Gandhi about 1920, but a younger photo of Sarla Devi. Only a fraction of these letters were published, and Gandhian scholars have declared this entire collection lost or burned, depending on who you talk to. Although historians had written about Sarla Devi's husband, Rambuj, and about her as very prominent supporters of the Indian National Congress. And historians had written about her promotion of khadi, or homespun cloth. The relationship between these two did not attract attention until fairly recently. The discussion of this friendship, based on what is published of their letters, which are very few, and supported by some very ephemeral references to somebody in the family said this or somebody in the family said that, has generated discussion in the last few years and general acceptance of the idea that there was an erotic relationship between Gandhi and Sarla Devi, and that it was allegedly ended by Gandhi in December of 1920. In this paper, I want to document how the historical establishment's treatment of Gandhi as a historical subject has changed over time, and especially in reference to the massive collection called The Collected Works of Mahatma Gandhi. And in the case of the relationship, I want to talk about how the few published letters and sort of family lore have been given precedence over the idea that there might be more letters. Now, the dominant story that I've alluded to paints this relationship as one of desire, abruptly ended by Gandhi, as I said, when his associates reminded him of his duty to family and the political movement. Now, it's not unusual, as everyone knows, for one account to take precedence over another. In this case, the accepted version now that their friendship was an erotic relationship means that this woman, who's one of India's preeminent colonial feminists, a very formidable woman in the nationalist movement, it paints her as an ambitious vamp. And it has ended all discussion of some of Gandhi's early ideas of promoting women as leaders. Now, what I want to talk about is these typed letters, and the way they point to a different interpretation of the relationship as one that was more egalitarian and more political than erotic. So the question of which letters are authentic and which are not points to the power of the established archive and how it has been used to assure that a particular version of history, one that actually sidelines women, is in control and triumphs. So let me just go to Gandhi's letters were given to me, as I said, by the son of this woman, and it was after I had been interviewing him about his mother, who had an autobiography. It was published serially in a magazine, but actually has not left a lot of documents. He talked about his mother, about his own life. He was brought up in the ashram with Gandhi. And at the end of one of our meetings, presented me with a package of letters. He said someone from the National Gandhi Museum had taken the originals to Delhi, but before he handed them over, he had them typed. He referred to the letters as documents that he worried could be easily misinterpreted, misconstrued, if people took sentences out of context. And he entrusted them to me and said, I hope you will try and see if you can find the originals, but if you write about them, please be sensitive to the context. So before I go any farther, and I hope you can see this, I took a sample of sentences out of some of the letters to give you some idea of what he meant when he said he worried that people would pick certain sentences and then make them into something sensational. So the first one in April, it's becoming more and more difficult, this parting. I look at your vacant seat, I'm utterly disconsolate. No woman and no man except killer back has so filled my life as you are doing now. Or a disturbed night, you haunted me the whole of it. In the morning, too, thoughts of you possessed me. I feel unhappy till I know that you are safely in Lahore. Or you continue to haunt me in my sleep. No wonder Panditji, he's talking about her husband, calls you the greatest Shakti, the greatest sort of feminine power of India. You've cast that spell over him, now you're casting it over me. However, when one reads the letters in their entirety, Gandhi also has sleepless nights about political issues, and he talks about, I dreamt of you and a political issue, and both of them disturbed my sleep. So when you read them in their entirety, they look a little different, but Gandhi also uses terms like my dearest Sarla. He refers to these as love letters, and he signs with love. And these would certainly raise questions about the relationship. Now, in the mid-70s, when I got these letters, Gandhi was recognized as the preeminent figure in the Indian freedom struggle, the architect of Satyagraha, and the Mahatma who provided the world with a new vision of politics. This was the time also when the project to collect, organize, and publish Gandhi's writings was in full swing. Prime Minister Nehru set up an office called the Collected Works of Mahatma Gandhi, and this office was charged with overseeing the collection and publication of all Gandhi's writings, speeches, personal notes, interviews, and letters, a huge task. They began their work in 1956 and began to produce the volumes in 1960. By 1994, they had finished and produced 100 volumes. The work was overseen by an advisory board chaired by Morarji Desai, but the first two editors were close associates of Gandhi, and I believe it was a 9-person board included his son and very close followers. They actually contacted member of Gandhi's families, like Deepak that I knew, and they contacted people all over the world, so South Africa, England, India, to locate copies. In other cases, they went to government and newspaper offices and the diaries of Gandhi's associates. The work of collecting was complicated by the fact it was in 3 languages, English, Gujarati, and Hindi, and they needed to authenticate each document. Now, Mr. Chaudhry assured me that these copies were made from the originals, and they had been taken to Delhi, he assumed, to become part of the collected works. But only 8 of his 81 letters actually made it into the collected works. And when I talk to other Gandhi scholars about this in India, they say, impossible, those letters were burned. He burned them. And someone else said, no, they were lost, so that everyone's convinced they don't exist. In 1998, the Ministry of Information began working on another edition, which has been highly criticized and now withdrawn. And so at present, they are working on a new edition, which is to go back to the original edition and reprint them. So just to, don't have that much time, but the discussion of Gandhi's relationship with Sarla Devi marks a departure from the books on him and his women followers that began to appear shortly after India gained independence. Among those books were books such as Manoben Gandhi's Bapu, My Mother, and Madeline Slade's book, or Miraben's book, Bapu's Letters to Mira. These are published in 1949, some of the earliest. These were followed very quickly by collected works that pulled together all Gandhi's ideas on women, published as things like Women and Social Injustice or Women's Role in Society. So by 1970, there was a substantial body of literature on Gandhi and women followers, Gandhi and his wife. These sources all reinforced the idea that Gandhi brought women out of their narrow and essentialist roles to join men in the struggle for freedom. Suchita Kripalani, a close follower, said that Gandhi's personality was such it inspired confidence not only in women, but in the guardians of women, their husbands, fathers, and brothers. Because his moral stature was high, when women came out and worked in the movement, family members knew that they were secure, they were protected. So by the mid-1970s, the predominant view was that Gandhi's ideas about women were revolutionary within the Indian context. In the 1974 report on the status of women in India, sort of a very foundational document to the way the women's movement has developed. The authors wrote that Gandhi precipitated a transformation of the attitude towards women, that Gandhi absolutely changed the game, that he said women could be leaders in the movement, and this was strikingly different. Despite this early interest in Gandhi, in his views on relationships with women, it was not until the 1980s and the 90s that historians began to analyze his family life. And I mean analyze it, question it in new ways, to look at his interactions with women and to begin to discuss his sexuality. Some of the resulting publications have sparked contentious debates and even the banning of books. And this has happened for a while with Joseph Lelyfeld's book. Now, responding to the revived discussion of Gandhi's experiments, and this was his sleeping naked with young women in 1946-47, some critics have called him a child molester and argued that Gandhi's statues should be removed from public spaces. But scholars have consistently returned to the collected works and again, the memories and the discussion in the family. Gandhi first discussed his own sexuality in 1906 when he announced that he was going to be celibate within his own marriage. And that discussion then goes on for a while, but no one was particularly critical of him. The second maybe major event in sort of thinking about Gandhi's deviation from the narrow path was his relationship with Sarla Devi, and it's referred to in a letter Gandhi wrote where he considered making Sarla Devi his, quote, spiritual wife. Now, then the third episode when people start to discuss Gandhi and relationships is this 1946-47 experiments in naked sleeping. There are the first feminist to discuss Gandhi at length is Madhu Kishwar, who actually is not at all critical of him, sees Gandhi as raising simple, ordinary women to the status of fellow workers. So her writing about him is very positive and said actually about Gandhi's relationship with Sarla Devi that it was, again, a political relationship that ended because his followers criticized it. Now, I've got a longer paper here, like other people tried to think about where I want to cut, but Gandhi's later 1946-47, this is in the picture on your right. This is the young women that become Gandhi's canes or his walking sticks. This attracted very negative attention and widespread disapproval within the movement, condemnation from some of his closest followers. At first, Gandhi defended the exercise, but finally, after defections and more controversy, ended the practice. This has been written about, I think, very interestingly by Vinay Lal, who calls Gandhi's experiments sexual celibacy or celibate sexuality. Now, let me go to who was Sarla Devi. Now, between these two major kind of discussions, the Brahmacharya and the 1946 experiments, is this relationship with Sarla Devi Chodurani. And just to tell you, she's from one of the most illustrious families in India, in Bengal, the daughter of great Rishi Debendranath Tagore, a great religious reformer, the daughter of one of the first women novelists, and the niece of Rabindranath Tagore. She attended Bethune School, completed BA honors in 1890, was very interested in movements to celebrate national heroes with martial acts, with sword play, lati play, songs that would celebrate them. She was, from all we know, one of the people that Swami Vivekananda greatly admired and thought of taking her to Europe as an example of well-educated, sophisticated Indian women, to kind of show the world that Indian women were not backward. She actually, in 1905 during the Swadeshi movement, so she has this long interest in politics from the 1890s. By 1905, she becomes part of the Swadeshi movement. There were rumors she would be arrested, and her marriage was arranged into the Punjab. So she moves to the Punjab. The first author to describe, and this is a very blurry picture, but maybe about the time I'm talking about, the first author to describe the relationship as a romance is somebody called Girja Kumar, who described her as a Bengali aristocrat, too conscious of being a Tagore, hypersensitive, and equally hyperactive. His chapter on Sarla Devi talks about her adoption of homespun cloth, made her Gandhi's fashion model. She became his heartthrob, these are terms he used, and the two of them behaved like lovelorn teenagers. He argues that she was ambitious and a social climber, and that she manipulated Gandhi into giving her a public platform she did not deserve. He goes on in this way that her fall from a position as Gandhi's companion was swift, and it was a result of his wife's jealousy linked with disdain of Gandhi's son and others who saw her in the vanguard of women's liberation. When Gandhi realized she was not who he thought, he began to distance himself, and the final breakup, Kumar says, came in December 1920. Gandhi, who had been dazzled by a woman unlike any he had met, lost sight of his goals. Once his followers drew his attention to his deviation, he snapped back and he excised Sarla Devi from his life. Now, what's really important is that this particular interpretation is picked up by Gandhi's grandson, Rajmohan Gandhi, in a book that's published a year later, and he actually uses the same sources and pretty much the same line without some of these terms like lovelorn teenagers. His is a bit more moderate and so on. So he again sees Gandhi as dazzled. Now, in the newest biography that's on its way out, got 1 minute, all right, the author, Pramod Kapoor, is absolutely sure that this romance kind of existed, and again, he uses the same sources and talks about her as demanding and jealous. Now, what I want to point to is that if we look at those letters, there is a very different story, and I'll try to make this very short. She was, when Gandhi met her, editing a newspaper, a fearless nationalist, and became very important in the independence movement in North India. Gandhi, I believe, was impressed by this woman who was cultured, extroverted, intellectual, politically active, and attractive, very well spoken, very well able to handle herself in a public platform. And what Gandhi has looked for, and Gandhi says this in earlier letters, he wants a woman leader who can be like the great goddesses of old and the great heroines of old and sort of shock and awe the audience. So let me just conclude. Moving ahead. The archive has been a very difficult place for South Asian historians, and particularly for South Asian historians studying women, because material is not here. The Gandhian archive is very complete. It's the collected works. It's been defended as thorough, impartial, and exhaustive, even though people very close to it who defend it point out all the missing items, and I've certainly found missing items in that. What interests me about the letters is they, like so many other letters collected, were taken to Delhi, but only a few of them were included in the collected works. They appear authentic, and they read as a collection that points to a relationship between Gandhi and Sarla Devi that was close, but never erotic, nor ever headed for marriage, which some of the sources suggest. When they're read next to his correspondence to a number of other women, his expressions of longing and endearment appear much like what you can find in other letters. And what has happened in this case of the Gandhi-Sarla Devi, and I'm going to the relationship, is, this is her when she was older, it has sidelined this woman who in 1933 made probably one of the most forceful feminist speeches ever made in India. This is an example, I think, of how power is used to assure that a particular version of history, one that reifies a certain kind of masculinity and demonstrates male control has triumphed. In the end, a version of history inclusive of different roles and images of women has been foreclosed. Thank you.
And now, as they used to say on a famous British television comedy show, for something completely different. I was going to talk this morning about national feeling among the Pashtun ethnic group in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and how Pashtun sentiments have been a source of power and influence for a range of forces in the region in recent decades. At the end, I'd also like to make one or two, I hope, provocative remarks about the nature and needs of research in this region and on such issues. Among the forces that have drawn very heavily on Pashtun sentiment are both the Afghan and the Pakistani Taliban, both of which are based in the Pashtun areas and draw by far the greater part of their support from ethnic Pashtuns, though not exclusively Pashtun support. And when the Obama administration coined the term AFPAC, a term which it's ever since been trying actually to escape from again, but is one of these terms that has, to a degree, stuck, to describe the theatre of operations for US forces combating militancy and terrorism in the region, what this theatre of operations really described was the Pashtun territories. Incidentally, on the subject of the Taliban, I do hope that those of you with an interest in this subject will come this afternoon to hear Alex Strick van Linschoten, who's with us, and who is one of the greatest experts in the world on the Taliban and its background. Now, the map here is an ethnic map of Pakistan and Afghanistan. I showed it to my small daughter and asked what she made of it, and she said, "It looks like a mess." And indeed, that is what it is. It is a mess. It is a very great mess. When it comes to the map itself, messy as it is, as so often with such ethnic maps, the mess on the map falls short of the reality. Actually, you could draw shadings in many areas where ethnicities overlap. Other groups which are described as ethnicities, well, let us not, for heaven's sake, get into the definition of what's an ethnicity, what's a nationality, and so forth. But even messier than the map suggests. What, however, it does bring out is the fact that the big orange blob in the middle, which is the Pashtuns, straddle the border, obviously, between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Where this map falls short is that there should be a really big blob down here as well in the city of Karachi. There are about, very roughly about, 40 million Pashtuns living today in Pakistan and Afghanistan. This, however, is an extremely rough estimate because there hasn't been an even minimally reliable census in Pakistan for more than a decade and a half now, and there never has been one in Afghanistan. There's not a single Afghan census on which one can rely. And there hasn't been one since the overthrow of the Taliban in 2001, because, of course, this whole question of ethnic proportions is political dynamite. In Afghanistan, the Pashtuns see themselves as the people of state, and indeed, Afghan is actually the Farsi, the Persian word for Pashtun. However, whatever they themselves may believe, the overwhelming consensus is that Pashtuns, though a plurality, are not in fact a majority of Afghanistan's population. One of the great problems when it comes to discussing these issues, and in the past for the United States and the Afghan government, in trying to strike an acceptable and stable ethnic balance in the Afghan state and armed forces, is precisely that there is no agreement on numbers and proportions. There are very few, actually I'd say basically none among my acquaintance, Afghan Pashtuns, and by the way Pakistani Pashtuns as well, who are not firmly convinced that they are an absolute majority of the population of Afghanistan. Very often their estimates range up to 70% or so, 70, 80%, as opposed to the 40, 45, which is the most common, though once again very rough, estimate of their proportion. What we can be pretty sure of is that around, or even more than, 2/3 of the Pashtuns in the world now live not in Afghanistan, where they have been historically the people of state, but in Pakistan. It was always a majority of Pashtuns in Pakistan, but the numbers have been enormously swelled, of course, over the past 35 years by successive waves of Afghan Pashtun refugees who have moved into Pakistan and increasingly are merging with the local Pashtun population. And by a good many estimates today, indeed, Kabul is undoubtedly the biggest Pashtun city in the world. But many people think, once again it's impossible to be sure, but many people think that the second biggest Pashtun city by numbers in the world is now not Peshawar, the capital of the Pashtun territories of Pakistan, nor Kandahar, the capital of the Afghan and Pashtun south of Afghanistan, but is in fact Karachi, because so many Pashtuns have moved down there to work and to live in recent decades. So the Pashtun ethnicity is split down the middle, and not just the ethnicity itself, but individual Pashtun tribes, by this frontier, commonly referred to as the Durand Line, after the British official Colonel Durand, who drew it in the 1890s. The border which was drawn to divide what the British themselves in private actually called not the state of the British Indian Empire and the state of Afghanistan, but in British documents they were referred to as respective spheres of influence between the two centres of power, running through the area of the Pashtun tribes, which on neither side of the line, then and once again, of course, now, were actually under the full administrative control, or indeed to a degree any administrative control, of the two governments on either side of the line. As I'm sure you all know, or most of you, reflecting Pashtun national sentiment, which has always bitterly resented this division, no Afghan government has ever recognized, since independence in 1947, the legitimacy of this line as a dividing line between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And strikingly enough, that was and remains true, this refusal to recognize the legitimacy of the Durand Line as a formal international frontier, that remains true of the Afghan Taliban. Despite all the help, all the shelter they have received from Pakistan over the years, they have always categorically refused to recognize the Durand Line, both because of their own beliefs about this, but also responding to the views of their Pashtun supporters and the ethnicity among whom they're based. In turn, Pakistani strategies towards Afghanistan over the past 2 generations have been critically influenced by fears in the Pakistani establishment of Pashtun national irredentist separatism, which threatens, of course, if it ever really took off, to break up and destroy Pakistan. This has greatly shaped the strategy of successive Pakistani military commands and governments when it comes to, I wouldn't exactly say diverting, because this, Islamism has been a core part of the Pashtun tradition in different forms for a very long time, but certainly seeking to channel Pashtun sentiment into Islamist movements which have been viewed as less dangerous to Pakistan than Pashtun nationalist movements. Of course, what Pakistani establishment has discovered belatedly and horrifyingly in recent years is that such Islamist movements have in fact proved even more dangerous, and that they have in fact tried to forge alliances with moderate Pashtun nationalism against such movements since the emergence of the Pakistani Taliban in recent years. Now, given that, let's say, a fairly brief glance at a map would indicate the centrality of the Pashtuns and Pashtun identity to many of the issues and problems which we have faced and which we have been talking about so much, of course, especially since 2001, but for anyone working on this region long before that. Why have these issues, in fact, been so rarely studied against the background of Pashtun ethnicity and in connection with analyses of Pashtun ethnic feeling and indeed of what the Pashtun ethnicity and national sentiment consists of. And there have been big, often much hyped books on the subject of the Taliban revolts in Pakistan and Afghanistan, like a recent one by Carlotta Gall, which hardly mentioned the Pashtun factor at all as a major issue. Well, perhaps the reason is best summed up in a famous nonsense poem, which goes, I'm sure you know it, "Yesterday upon the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away." There is a sense in which the Pashtuns, as a factor, are absolutely obviously there, and yet are also invisible, invisible to study, or at least very difficult to study. Now, when it comes to reasons why we and many others have wished, not that Pashtun national feeling would necessarily go away, but that it might perhaps take a different form or go and spend some time doing something else for a while. If you look back over the past 50 years or so, one time when Pashtun nationalism, when there was a real attempt to exploit Pashtun nationalism, was by the Afghan government of Sardar Dawood in the 1950s. And his deliberate attempts to stir up Pashtun irredentist feeling in Pakistan and the Pakistani response that this provoked, leading to the fall of his government in Afghanistan, the sort of quasi-democratic establishment, the severe weakening of the Afghan state, in many ways initiated the entire Afghan catastrophe of the past 35 years, and all the disasters for others, including, of course, Americans since 9/11, for Soviets before that, to which the Afghan catastrophe has in turn created. In the late 1970s, after the overthrow and murder of Dawood's restored government in Afghanistan, the split between the Khalq and the Parcham factions of the Afghan Communist Party, a split largely, though once again, one always has to say never exclusively in these terms, because none of these allegiances were never exclusive in ethnic terms. But the division between the Khalq and the Parcham factions, largely along ethnic lines, with the Khalq defined by Pashtun ethnicity and loyalty, helped to destroy the communist government from within and bring about the Soviet intervention in an effort to prop it up or preserve it. The Soviet intervention, in turn, led directly to all the subsequent catastrophes. Among them, the mobilization of Pashtun sentiment in Pakistan by the Pakistani regime of General Zia, but of course completely backed by the United States, in support of the jihad in Afghanistan, and the tremendous mobilization and enhancement of Islamist sentiment in the Pashtun areas of Pakistan to strengthen the Afghan jihad, and an encouragement of an identification of the Pashtuns of Pakistan with the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, which of course, bizarrely and ironically enough, helped in some respects, if not to abolish, certainly gravely to weaken the border between the two countries in ways which, of course, subsequently have come back disastrously to bite Pakistan, but also, of course, to bite the Western effort in Afghanistan since 9/11. Among a key part of the support for the Afghan jihad was strong Pakistani support for the Hizb-i-Islami party of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, an Islamist radical party, but one which also drew more and more as time went on Pashtun ethnic sentiment. This then contributed directly after the fall of the communist regime in Afghanistan in 1992 to a ferocious civil war basically along ethnic lines, in which Kabul was devastated, and in which both the resulting chaos and the perception of non-Pashtun rule in Kabul, essentially for the first time in history, though there were certain precedents, then created the basis for the rise of the Taliban and the Taliban conquest of most of Afghanistan and everything that came out of that, including, of course, 9/11. After 2001, just as the Mujahideen had in the 1980s, the survivors of the Taliban and their leadership crossed the border into the Pakistani Pashtun areas, especially the tribal areas and northern Baluchistan, where they are welcomed by most of the local population on the basis of ethno-religious solidarity with the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, just as once again had been the case with the Mujahideen and Afghan refugees in the 1980s. This in turn, though through a series of stages, helps to plays the critical part in setting off the Pashtun-based Islamist insurgency in Pakistan, which in 2007 began to call itself the Pakistani Taliban, an insurgency which has now claimed more than 30,000 lives and led to a succession of dreadful atrocities, the latest being the school massacre in Peshawar. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, the conviction of US policymakers, and by the way, probably an accurate perception, that most Pashtuns would not accept the presidency, the leadership of a non-Pashtun over the country, and that if there was an attempt to install such a leadership, it would greatly strengthen support for the Taliban in the Pashtun areas. This played the critical role in the selection of Hamid Karzai as America's Afghan leader. How shall I put this diplomatically? If one had had a completely objective and neutral choice of potential leaders of Afghanistan, it is not necessarily certain that he would have been the one who would have been selected. To be even more diplomatic, last year, the euphemistically called, shall we say, arrangement of the results of the Afghan presidential elections, leading to the success of now President Ashraf Ghani, and the acceptance of this by the United States was once again critically influenced by the perception, once again quite possibly an accurate one, that to allow Mr. Abdullah to win would provoke a ferocious reaction on the part of many Pashtuns. That was certainly something that I was told in Helmand a couple of years ago, and that therefore was just too dangerous to allow. The result, of course, however, has been to leave whatever was left of Afghan democracy in tatters. Now, meanwhile, in Pakistan, while a majority of Pakistani Pashtuns, it's difficult to say what the truth is in the tribal areas, because trying to do opinion surveys on the ground there would basically, well, you wouldn't have much chance to analyse the results, put it that way, because you'd come back with your head under your arm. But what I have observed certainly very strongly from my own researches in other Pashtun areas is that while, no doubt, a large majority of Pakistani Pashtuns do not support the Pakistani Taliban revolt as such, or their ideology or their desire for a revolution throughout Pakistan, they do sympathize on the whole very strongly with the Afghan Taliban. And it was the son of one of the leaders of the secular nationalist Awami National Party in Pakistan who told me that the problem is that every Pashtun has been brought up from his cradle to believe that to resist foreign occupation, and especially infidel occupation, is part of what it is to do Pashtu, to follow the Pashtun way, the honourable Pashtun way. And it's very difficult for us to argue against that. It's a critical weakness of our position, he said. There is also, among the Pashtuns of Pakistan, and this extends more widely into the population, but especially among the Pashtuns, a deep, deep desire for peace. Peace with the Pakistani Taliban, an end to what is widely seen as a kind of Pashtun civil war in Pakistan, but one created not by Pashtuns, or at least so the population would like to believe, but by others, by the United States, and so forth and so on. And this was critical in the electoral success in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa of Imran Khan's Pakistan Justice Party in the last Pakistani elections, and to both his party and the government and the national winning party, the PMLN, coming to power on a platform of peace, of negotiating peace with the Pakistani Taliban. Something which, this sentiment has therefore contributed enormously to the lack of will in Pakistan on the part of Pakistani governments when it comes to combating the Islamist insurgency. So very briefly, by the way, if you start to sing, can I sing back? Can we have a duet?
Yeah,
but very briefly, so there it is upon the stair. Why isn't it at the same time there? Because none of these movements, except for the ANP, which is now the weakest, none of these movements have ever defined themselves as a Pashtun national movement. The Taliban deny categorically that they are such a thing. So does Imran Khan, if you ask him. The reason being, of course, that on both sides of the line, their ambitions, their agendas are national. The Afghan Taliban believes that it is still the legitimate government of the whole of Afghanistan, including not just the orange areas, but the blue, the purple, the green, and so on, and therefore cannot define itself in Pashtun national terms if it wishes to have a success. Similarly, Imran Khan wants to rule in Islamabad, not just in Peshawar. He can't rule in Peshawar anyway, him personally, because he's only a Pashtun by ultimate origin. He doesn't speak Pashtun. Ashraf Ghani too, although clearly he has come to power on the basis of Pashtun sentiment and calculations about Pashtun sentiment, cannot call himself a Pashtun nationalist figure. He's an Afghan figure, even if actually Pashtuns see it as one and the same thing. This means, of course, that for the standard approaches of Western political science and analysis and so forth, there is no there. It's very difficult to get to grips with this sentiment when it is not reflected in documents, in formal statements, in formal agendas, and so forth. And another reflection of this is that until the old Northwest Frontier Province was renamed Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in 2010, there wasn't a single administrative division, either in Pakistan or Afghanistan, which contained Pashtun in its name. So very briefly, one has to dig. One has to dig, and one has to dig as far as one can on the ground in order to penetrate beneath the opacity with which this issue is talked about in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the problem is that in such digging, quantitative methods are almost useless, in part because of the total unreliability of national statistics in both countries. Even opinion surveys are of limited utility because, once again, so many people will actually refuse to talk about it in these terms. And so I hope that you will not laugh at me if I say that actually the most useful tool on this, and actually I could talk about a range of other issues as well, is the ancient, but as many people say, declining art of conversation. You just have to spend an awful lot of time talking to these people, which requires drinking a lot of tea with most of the Pashtun population and a lot of whiskey with others. The best asset to research is therefore, in some ways, an iron gut and a strong head. Thank you.
I'd like to take a couple of minutes of my time to recognize the committee that put this conference together. And if they're here, I would appreciate if they would stand up so we'd recognize them. You have to understand that this took a whole year of work, of a group of faculty who sat together and thought this through to put, and I think that as faculty chair, it behooves me to at least recognize what they have done. Professor Pirbhai Reza, are you here? Yes, please. Well, I can only use one word for him, it's gem. He's a true gem, and I think everybody does realize that. Professor Anabel, please. Another gem, Firat Uruk. Firat. I would also like to say that Firat has agreed to be the chair of next year's conference. It's going to be on women, but he's still going to be the chair of the conference, so I'm very, very glad to announce that. Ahmed Qassas, is Ahmed here? He's probably teaching class, but let's give him a hand anyway. Amy Nestor, she's on leave, but we also have to recognize her. And last, the youngest, is Jose Asturias, our genius economist. So probably teaching as well. I'd also like to thank and recognize the events staff, Maya Primorak, with her staff, Maha and Rana, and also the travel staff, Sally and Rizlan. They really are behind all the good work that has been accomplished. And last but not least, our own Mahaveen Hazam, who really keeps the department going. So thank you very, very much. This is from my time, so you don't have to worry or sing. So. Oops. All right. Police officers of the precinct of Matareya in Egypt on Sunday arrested a woman assuming the identity of a man while driving a taxi. It was found that she took the identity of a male driver so as to support her family. This story first seemed surprising, but soon other stories were brought to readers through articles covering odd types of jobs undertaken by women and why some of them chose to disguise their gender. Getting dressed up as a man is really nothing new to Egyptian society. The example of ancient Egypt's Queen Hatshepsut, who dressed and ruled as a man, was certainly not unique. Today, the practice seems to have become widespread. A woman in her 70s was videoed putting on male clothes to go out and work as a shoe shine. Widowed very young, she raised her children and siblings. People on her street know her and see nothing surprising about the work she has been doing for decades. Sisa, another woman in her late years, told of her disguise as a man for over 40 years to raise her children and then her grandchildren. Other women who disguised as men and were interviewed told similar stories, and several drove taxis or tuk-tuks in popular areas. Most women, however, who undertook daily labor performing so-called men's work were dressed normally, although several said they felt safer behind the face veil. Street vending, in particular, appeared as one important venue open for the poorest of women, eking out a living to support their families. Hanem, a radishes and herbs seller in her 80s, is one of those. Having raised 9 children following her husband's death, she had to take responsibility for raising 6 children when her son died. Raising a family is actually quite usual for Egypt's women. With early marriage and open divorce, abandonment by husbands, and early deaths of husbands, women are often left to fare for themselves, their young siblings and children. Add to that double-digit unemployment figures among the men and the 35% figure announced by the National Council for Women of families supported by women providers, among whom are 5 million peasant families, makes sense. Now, what does not make sense is the fact that this reality about life in Egypt is not taken into consideration by its laws or by dominant social discourse, whether we are talking about conservative Islamists or self-proclaimed liberals. A normative picture presented by literature, and particularly religious literature, shows women as belonging to the home and not equal partners in economic production. Laws were developed based on the normative picture, and the center of legal discussions becomes the women's duties from within an understanding of what fiqh, that's Islamic theology, says religion requires of her. Since the producers of fiqh and law represent conservative patriarchy, deploying hegemony constructed and enabling arguments, basic principles of law and fundamental rights have moved very little from a medieval fiqhi framework. For historians who research the lived realities of women in the past, the contradictions between discourse and reality is glaring. Women's work and economic participation has been a constant since ancient times and until today. Using the same Turathi literature as the fuqaha, with a new reading and intensive research in Sharia court and other records, historians have shown that Muslim women worked in just about every field. in agricultural labor, where they carried a large percentage of often the more back-breaking duties, herding and watering clan cattle, undertaking hard labor in stone quarries, domestic labor of girls from very, very early years to very late years, as slaves and concubines, as market sellers, merchants, doctresses, midwives, teachers, muftiyat, and the list continues. Yet the same lack of recognition of lived realities by medieval fuqaha continues today, thereby permitting the continued peripheralization of women, limiting women's rights by confining the discussion to a rubric of women's role, enframed within a discourse of morality, social stability, and even patriotism. That the subjects and discussions of this fiqhi discourse has little relevance to today's problems and the context in which Islamic society lives speaks to the continued power of this fiqhi discourse, language, ideas, and narratives inherited over the generations that gained them the legitimacy of time and allowed for an absolutist form of holiness to surround them. As keepers of this discourse, as both its guardians and beneficiaries, holding on to the sole power of interpretation, notwithstanding ability or standard of learning, state fuqaha, allied to state power and traditional social forces forming hegemonic combines, have enabled the control over laws and public discourse and institutions of morality to create a patriarchal system that is difficult to budge. At the heart of this combine, a common denominator joining otherwise disparate groups with divergent interests, women's role becomes a central concern whose definition unites them. And even though women's role is a modern discourse, medieval sources are used to construct laws that ironically did not even represent the lived realities of the periods in which these fiqhi discourses were produced, not even then contemporary Sharia court practices that saw fiqhi opinions as a guide rather than law. Yet today, these discourses have been turned into a gendered framework for law that is held onto as Islamic law, and hence questioning them becomes questioning Islam itself. There is a clear contradiction in this picture. On the one hand, society is largely dependent on women's work, yet this work is kept invisible, and that controls legal changes that are needed to allow society as a whole to move ahead by giving women the security and financial rights due to her. At the same time, conservative fiqhi discourse has become the basic approach of the state, with its political and coercive apparatuses, whether we are talking about liberals or conservatives. Yet the constitutions written and the public discourse speaks about women's rights and equalities. As demonstrations involved with the various revolutions and movements since January 2011 have been highly dependent on the participation of women. At the same time, there has been an increase in gender harassment of various times and at various times, and crimes against women has been on the increase, as has been the volume of the fiqh religious discourse calling for the confinement of women and reversal of the legal gains she is thought to have gained during the last 10 decades. Thus, following the January 2011 revolution, 2 constitutions were written and voted for by Egyptians. The first belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood, who held power for 1 year in 2012. The second constitution was promulgated following the June 30th June 30th, 2013 revolution, and was celebrated by its authors as a great improvement, particularly for minorities and women. Excuse me. Both constitutions contained statements of full equality. Thus, Article 5 of the 2012 Constitution and 53 of the 2014 Constitution spoke of equality of all citizens. Men and women with the 2014 Constitution expanding the rights to include equality before the law, irrespective of religious faith, race, or disability, and state guarantees to take measures to eliminate all forms of discrimination. It is true that the 2014 liberal constitution is superior in regards to its declaration of the rights of women. For while the 2012 Article 3 refers to women as sisters of men and partners in all national gains and responsibility, thereby preferalizing women as adjuncts to men rather than male players, the Article 11 of the 2014 Constitution is explicit in regards to gender equality and makes it the responsibility of the state to ensure the achievement of equality between men and women in all civil, political, economic, and social rights, including parliamentary representation and holding public office. Still, both constitutions represent an unwillingness to allow for full equality nor put limitations on male authority. This is achieved through the inclusion of a series of constitutional articles dealing with law, nature of the state, family, morality, religion, and religious authority. Placed together, they create an edifice of control over women, reflecting dominant fiqhi thinking since the medieval period. While all claim tajdeed, in fact, taqlid is utilized and established as basis for laws that confine women. Here, the power of discourse cannot be emphasized enough, for much of the language used is familiar, and the sources have gained sanctity over time. The problem spots for women are furthermore couched within language that appears beneficial to women. Article 11 of the 2014 Constitution, for example, commits the states to fighting all forms of violence against women. This is admirable and necessary, particularly given the increased harassment and violence against women reaching almost femicide if reported crimes against women in daily newspapers are taken as a gauge. But the same Article 11 then adds a commitment to ensure the empowerment of women to reconcile family duties and work requirements, to provide care and protection of motherhood, childhood, and women-headed households and the elderly and women most in need. This is very problematic. By tying women's rights and empowerment with family duties and placing motherhood and childhood within the same article, a role for women has been defined. Furthermore, Article 11 follows Article 10, which states that the family is the basis of society, founded on religion, morality, and patriotism, and the state is keen on the cohesion and stability and the consolidation of its values. It would be hard to speak against this language, the language of these two articles. The words speak to principles of common concern to all Egyptians. The same can be said about Article 93, promising the state's commitment to international human rights conventions and agreements ratified by Egypt to become the force of law after being published in accordance with the conditions prescribed. Here, women's rights are tied to family, households, morality, and social stability. At the same time, however, international human rights conventions and agreements were ratified by Egypt with reservations to any rules contradicting culture and religion. This meant laws dealing with inheritance, family, and gender, laws placed within the framework of religion and/or culture, and hence unquestionable. The same connections were included in the Muslim Brotherhood's Constitution of 2012. Article 10 declares that the family is the basis of society and is founded on religion, morality, and patriotism. The state is keen to preserve the genuine character of the Egyptian family, its cohesion and stability, and to protect moral values, all as regulated by law. The state shall ensure maternal and child health services free of charge and enable the reconciliation between the duties of a woman toward her family and her work. The state shall provide special care and protection to female breadwinners, divorced women, and widows. Not much different than the other one. In other words, the 2014 Liberal Constitution changed little from the Muslim Brotherhood 2012 Constitution. The same philosophy, tying women to a specific role within the family and providing support for women, supporting families as an exception, a weaker group needing protection, similar to widows and divorcees without a supporter. As in the 2014 Liberal Constitution, the MB Constitution declared that the principles of the Islamic Sharia is the main source of law. Here, however, an important addition made fiqh explicitly the source of Sharia. The principles of Islamic Sharia include general evidence, foundational rules, rules of jurisprudence, and credible sources accepted in Sunni doctrines and by the larger community. This is Article 219. This simply means that books of fiqh become the source of law for Egyptian society, relations in general, and for general relations more specifically, since citizenship, criminal, and commercial laws are based largely on European codes, and only personal status laws are considered to be entirely Sharia-based, notwithstanding that these codes themselves differ significantly from what was practiced before. One last point needs to be made here, and that is in regards to Article 64 of the 2012 Constitution, which states, "There shall be no forced labor except in accordance with law," left as a general statement without explanations or conditions, and the door is open to all sorts of abuses, particularly of women's labor and child labor, as is the case in much of Egypt at present. The potential of extremist forms of gender abuse was rearing its head and being placed in the Constitution to be later detailed as willed by what was expected at the time to be a Salafi Muslim Brotherhood-dominated National Assembly. Clearly, the 2014 Constitution addressed much of the gender discrimination embedded in the 2012 Constitution and closed the door to unconditional fiqh interpretations that could only be detrimental to the rights of women. The 2014 Constitution, however, still fell short of expectation and continued the same patriarchal discourse that made the central philosophy of law a combination of family, morality, religion, and patriotism. With this formula, the life of women and gender relations would continue to be seen through biological differences, treated as weaker and dependent, work being considered a necessity rather than a right, no matter that the Constitution declares work to be the right of every individual, and laws confirming this continued dependency also conferred by application of a Sharia guided by a philosophy of social morality. Qawama of men over women, notwithstanding social or economic conditions, guaranteed by the Azhar, whose fiqhi approach differed little from the Salafis and Muslim Brotherhood in their preference to taqlid and reverence of medieval fuqaha like Bukhari and al-Shafi'i. While most Egyptians agreed on the Sharia as the main source of law, the formula set out by the 2014 Constitution guaranteed that the Sharia to be adopted was its interpretation according to medieval fiqh, with adjustments made to fit the needs of economic and political conditions. And sure enough, since 2011, any gains made by women during the last decades became the focus of attacks by various groups, and most particularly khul'a law and other laws. I have to conclude. 2 minutes, you said?
You're down to one now.
I'm under one, so. Okay, this presentation focused on two specific points: the participation of women in Egypt's economy and society, including political activism, and secondly, the fiqh discourse that is parallel and powerful. Yet, like the women's participation remains invisible in comparison to the loud power of the press or direct coercive power of army and police. Yet much power exists in these two locations: the power of society to continue to function in the worst of conditions, largely due to women's continued stability of home and workplace, as well as political pressure whose impact only becomes clear when it coalesces and moves, and the power of fiqh discourse that underlies all aspects of politics as the culture keeping a hegemonic combined in power. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to this amazing conference and for the great hospitality. I'll talk today about the political economy of science, religion, and growth. This talk is based on a joint work with Roland Benabou and Andrea Vindigne. And I would like to start from the aim of this conference. This conference is about the study of power in a multidisciplinary approach. So what is power in economics? There are different kinds of power. If you ask to some students that are here, the first year student, they would come to their mind the market power, monopoly power, namely the ability of a firm to charge prices above some sort of cost. But Here, what we care most, given the approach in other fields, the common concept of power is political power, namely the possibility of deciding the allocation of resources in the country. And when I talk about the allocation of resources, I mean fiscal policies, taxes, public good provision, income redistribution, natural resources, or regulation about the economic activity. But why studying political power is important? What does it mean, studying political power for an economist? It means many things. First of all, studying the rules of the game, how you get to power, how you can exercise it, namely the role of institutions, how institutions are determined, which is the interactions of agents to get into power, and all this is about to study the effects on economic outcomes. And why is this important, again, for an economist? Because this interaction, all the behavior on the individual to get into power has effect on economic growth, namely on the growth of income per capita. Income, when we talk about income for an economist, this is synonymous of welfare. Okay? And what economists care most is the increase in income. Of course, when you think to power, the first things you go to your mind is the distribution of income, because power decides also the distribution of income. But is the distribution of income in the society so important for an economist? Well, yes, it is from a positive analysis. Namely, in a positive analysis, we want to understand world. And this is important, how resources will be distributed. But ultimately, the important things for an economist is whether the distribution of resources have an effect on economic growth. Just to cite a paper of 20 years ago, this paper was, "Is inequality harmful for growth?" Okay? So I know, namely, the approach was income inequality in the society affect how people get into fight for power, affect fiscal policy. This ultimately affect economic growth, okay, in one way or another. And economic growth is important because relative to income distribution, because for an economist, we don't know, we don't want to enter in some sort of normative analysis, which require judging whether more unequal society is good or not, but we care about the size of the pie, and this also makes sense because imagine a more unequal society, but which grows at higher rate. After some years, then also the poorer people will be better, okay? So I will focus here on economic growth and political power. We said what is economic growth, growth of income, and this is mainly driven by innovation in science and technology, which has to be thought in a wide way. It's not only new products, new methods of production, but also new methods of productions in the society. Think about, for example, the inclusion of the women in the production. And what explains economic growth? We said economic growth is explained by innovation, by new knowledge, new methods of production. But and the economics studies all this, we know how science and technology, new innovation is produced. But if you look at the world, it's difficult to explain big differences in economic growth just by looking at the technology. Okay? Also here in Abu Dhabi, you can get very good pizza or very good pasta, which is a fundamental aspect of technology for people living in some countries. So technology can be easily transferred and knowledge can be easily transferred. So we need to look for some other candidates that explain economic growth. One of these candidates may be institutions, namely whether the political system is democratic or not, there are protection of property rights. And for example, just to give you an example, in some previous work, I proposed theories with other co-authors about military dictatorship. Why an economy should care about the political regime, Okay? Not per se. We don't care about the political regime per se, not because this is important, but as economists. We care because political regimes, they affect the process of economic growth. Similarly, civil wars. Okay? Of course, civil wars is a very important issue, but we care because this has effect on economic growth and on welfare of the citizen. Another candidate for economic growth is culture. Culture is a very difficult to define. As you can imagine, is all these beliefs and values of individuals in the society, and it's difficult to basically really define culture in a very clear way, and economists always really like to be very precise on this. And inside the culture, we can say that the main aspect of culture, which is also the one which is the most easily that can be defined more easily, is religion. Okay? And in the work that I'm going to present today, what we want to do is to analyze the relationship between religion and innovation, and therefore on the effect on growth, going through politics. Okay? This may not be the only channel. It can be also an effect of religion on innovation, and I have another work doing that, but here we, given the focus of the conference, we go through the political power. And the starting point is that throughout history, and to this day, there are periodic clashes between science and organized religion. And the political power then arbitrates. Just to give you some example, just to give you an idea, religion proposes a view of the world. Okay? And sometimes the scientific discoveries may contradict, falsify, and they're in contradiction with some important aspect of religion. Okay? But you can also think that some innovation, like contraceptive, may reduce the level of religiosity in the society and generate, therefore, the opposition of the church, where I say church in religious authorities. Okay? Just to give you some example taken from the history, I'm sure you know much better these things better than me, so I'll be fast. Take, for example, the case of Aristotle. Aristotle some books were translated in Latin since the 6th century, and they became really incorporated into the church school curriculum called the New Logic, because they were abstract principles and rule of thought. And during the 12th century, some lost treatises of Aristotle in natural philosophy were rediscovered and translated. Okay? However, these books contained views about physical world, human life, universe, that were incompatible with the Bible. For example, in this meteorology book, there is written that there will be no end to time and the world is eternal, which contradicts the description of creation in the book of Genesis. On the heavens, the world must be unique, which implies that God is not omnipotent, okay, under this view. And therefore, these were declared heretical by the church, and those who read in public or in private were under the penalty of excommunication. But then Thomas Aquinas arrived, and he tried to make things compatible. Okay? It's what we call in our work repairing, okay? Repairing the beliefs. And he tried to make compatible the Christian doctrine and the Aristotelian natural philosophy. And the idea was to distinguish between the domain of the reason and the domain of the faith, okay, in this medieval synthesis. And he said that ultimately truths are elements of faith, but human reason can play an ancillary role. For example, the doctrine of divine revelation is not acceptable unless it is preceded by a demonstration of the existence of God, which is an accomplishment of human revelation. Okay? So this is an example where you can have a clash between science and religion, but then the religious authority can adapt their beliefs to make them compatible. Another case is the famous heliocentric theories of the world that I'm not gonna discuss because it's known to everybody. And I would like to arrive to science and religion in the Islamic world, where today Islam is viewed as a religion which is, let's say, anti-science, not very friendly to science, but there are no religions that are friendly or not friendly to science. They change over time. I mean, if we look at Islam in the 7th century, okay, where there was the Muslim expansion in the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe, then there was the need for religious authority to engage in local debates with non-Muslims in the process of proselytizing Islam. And I mean, according to Lewis and many others, the degree of tolerance of Islam was without precedent, okay, even compared to other religions. And indeed, in that period, scientific progress flourished. I mean, there were major developments in algebra, trigonometry, and many other sciences, okay? And if afterwards there was a change in other directions where Islam has become, let's say, culturally more rigid, it's because there was no need to engage in some sort of confrontation with the science and to convince people. And indeed, if we look to the case of the printing press, the Ottoman Empire forbade the printing press until basically the 19th century, okay? But we don't have just to go at Islam. Look at the United States, which is the most advanced country in the world, and you know better than me that take, for example, the Darwin evolution. Darwin evolution initially got the opposition in many Western countries. However, then it was widely accepted. U.S. is still the country where, among the advanced countries, where there is still an opposition against Darwin evolution. Take the other example of stem cell research, where President Bush restricted federal fundings for research for many years, as well as the stance on climate change. Now, I want to focus a little bit on the relationship between innovation and religiosity around the world, okay? If you look to this graph, what you see is that you have religiosity, namely, which is measure the religiosity of countries. It's measure how many people here are religious, okay? And in the y-axis, you have innovation, which is measured by patents per capita. This is for different here, and there is a negative relationship between innovation and religiosity. More religious countries are less innovative. This is an unconditional correlation. If you use other measures like belief in God, you get the same result. But then you can say, well, there are other things that may correlate with religiosity, like GDP per capita, population, education, and all that. And once you control for all these things, this negative relationship between innovation and religiosity still holds. But then, let's do another example. Let's take the United States. This relationship holds a whole within the United States, okay? Here you have countries, you know, the Bible Belt there, that are more religious, and these are less innovative. And again, take different kind of measure for religiosity, control for many other things, and this relationship survive, okay? This instead is a graph showing that in countries where people are more religious, there is less income redistribution, which is measured by social spending in percentage of GDP. So, which is the Howard theory? I just sketch the model that we do in the paper. The idea is the following. You have scientific discoveries that, if diffused and implemented, reduce the productivity, increase the productivity in the society. So it's good to have this innovation, but some of them may erode the religious belief, either because they are in contradiction with the view of the world of their religion, or because it's innovation like contraception that may reduce religiosity. Citizens differ in two dimensions. One is income, the other one is religion. So you have different groups, and to get no one group as the majority, so to get them to get to power, you need to form a coalition with someone else. And what does the government do? The government in power can allow this idea to spread or spend resources to prevent and impede the diffusion of innovation, and also it chooses fiscal policies, namely taxes, provision of public goods that can be religious or not, okay? Or, when I talk about fiscal policy, include them also laws like abortion and other laws that may be important for religious people, okay? Let's say laws that may adhere more or less to a religious precept, okay? And then in our model, we also say that the religious sector, we call the church, may undertake adaptation of the doctrine when the innovation is conflicting with the new knowledge, okay? So, which is basically, so we have the scientific progress may affect religious belief, the religious belief affect the coalition of groups going to power, and this implies that you may have effect on the final result on who get in power and what's the fiscal policy. Okay? So the first implication for fiscal policy is that religion is a wedge issue. Okay? So in countries with low religiosity, you have secular government that come to power and that implement welfare state policies characterized by high taxes, high redistribution that benefit the poor, with low spending in religious public good. While in countries like, for example, the US, where religiosity is higher, you have more provision of religious public good, but less taxes, less redistribution, because it's more likely that religious and the rich come to power. Let's look at the global picture. The global picture that we obtain is the following. We have three regimes. Okay? The first regime is the Western Europe regime, where we have secularization. Namely, it's a regime where income is high and religiosity is low. You have declining of religiosity. The new innovations are not basically adopted by the church. You get high taxes, high public goods, and the secular government coming to power. Then you have the theocratic regime, Iran, Pakistan, where you have high level of religiosity, doctrinal rigidity, and the blocking of innovation that is in contradiction with religion. In here, what you observe is stagnation of income. Then finally, you have the third regime, which I said is US, which has relatively high religiosity, but this is coexist with a good attitude towards science. So in these cases, you have fiscal policies characterized by low income redistribution, provision of religious public good, tax exemptions, for example, but the church undertakes what we call the repairing, usually. Okay? And indeed, one example that our theory can explain is why, under some circumstances, you may have, in a country like US, that the innovation is blocked. Look, for example, the case of stem cell research. Indeed, in countries like US, an increase in income inequality can make more easy the coalition between the rich and the religious poor. And this coalition basically forms and has more incentive to block innovation because the rich are richer, so they don't want to lose power because have more to lose. And this implies that they will be more available to block the innovation that erode the religious belief. And indeed, in the United States, in the last 20, 25 years, you have an increase in income inequality, which can somehow be at the heart, can explain why in the recent year the attitude of the religious right in the United States have been more anti-science than it was in the past. I am finished my time, right? Or
You have about 10 seconds.
10 seconds, and with 10 seconds, I just wanted to say that here we explain the link between religiosity and innovation going from the political power, but religiosity and innovation can also have a direct channel. And indeed, in another work that I have with the same co-authors, we show that at individual levels, people that are more religious, they tend to be more anti-science, more against science and technologies. And this controlling for all the possible factors, namely individual characteristics like education, income, sex, and so on, and also the type of religion. So, of course, then you can have religions that, for the reason I said, the evolution over time can be more pro-science, less anti-science, but the general pattern you obtain is that people that are more religious are also less, tend to place less importance to innovation, which is a direct channel through which you can observe how religiosity affects innovation and therefore growth. Then I stop, okay? No singing, okay? You have to...
Thank you very much.
Thank you.